this episode, we move into a topic that sits right in the middle of real-world risk work, because identifying a problem is only the beginning of responsible security and risk management. Organizations discover weaknesses all the time, but what separates a disciplined organization from a careless one is what happens next. Some problems are recorded clearly, assigned to the right people, fixed within reasonable time frames, and checked again to make sure the fix actually worked. Other problems drift from meeting to meeting, get renamed, get delayed, or quietly become part of normal business life without anyone making a conscious decision. That is where issue, finding, and exception management becomes so important for certified in risk and information systems control, risk thinking. A beginner should hear this topic as a way of answering one simple question. When a weakness, gap, or policy break is discovered, how does the organization make sure it is understood, handled, tracked, and either corrected or deliberately accepted? Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyberauthor.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. A finding is usually the observed result of some type of review, assessment, audit, test, or monitoring activity. It is the statement that says something has been noticed and documented, such as a missing control, an outdated process, or a mismatch between what should be happening and what is actually happening. An issue is often the broader problem or condition that needs attention because of that finding, including its impact, ownership, remediation path, and tracking status. An exception is different because it usually refers to a known departure from a required standard, policy, or control expectation that has been formally allowed for a period of time. These terms are related, but they are not identical, and that distinction matters. A finding tells you what was observed, an issue tells you what must be managed, and an exception tells you that the organization knows a rule is not being met and has chosen, under defined conditions, to permit that gap temporarily or in a limited way. Many beginners assume that once a weakness is found, the hardest part is over. In reality, the discovery is often the easiest part because modern organizations produce findings constantly through audits, vulnerability reviews, risk assessments, control tests, regulatory examinations, incident reviews, and internal quality checks. The real challenge is preventing those observations from turning into unmanaged risk. A finding that is not analyzed may be misunderstood. A finding that is not assigned may belong to no one in practice. A finding that is not prioritized may sit beside far more serious problems without a clear response. Good management exists because organizations have limited time, limited money, limited staff, and many competing demands. Without discipline, the loudest problem gets attention instead of the most important one, and over time the organization starts living with preventable weaknesses that everyone can see, but no one feels empowered to resolve. A strong way to understand the process is to think of it as a controlled path from discovery to decision. Something is observed and documented. Then the organization determines whether that observation is real, how serious it is, what caused it, what could happen if it remains open, who owns it, and what should be done next. Sometimes the answer is immediate remediation. Sometimes the answer is compensating control, where another safeguard reduces the risk until the main problem can be fixed. Sometimes the answer is a formal exception because the organization cannot comply fully right now but still needs to operate. Sometimes the answer is risk acceptance by the appropriate authority if the cost of fixing the problem exceeds the benefit or if the exposure is low enough to tolerate. The important lesson is that issue, finding, and exception management is not only about tracking records. It is about creating a repeatable decision process so that known weaknesses do not live in a gray area. The quality of a finding matters from the moment it is recorded. A vague finding is hard to act on because different people will interpret it differently. If a report says access controls are weak, that may sound serious, but it leaves too many questions unanswered. Which access controls are weak? Where are they weak? How was that determined? What requirement was not met? And what risk does that create for the organization? A useful finding usually contains enough detail to explain the condition, the expected state, the evidence supporting the observation, and the risk or potential impact tied to the gap. That does not mean writing a novel for every issue. It means being precise enough that the business owner, control owner, auditor, and risk team can all understand the same problem in the same way. Clear findings reduce arguments, reduce delay, and make it easier to move from observation to meaningful action instead of endless clarification. Once a finding is recorded, organizations need a way to evaluate severity and priority. Severity reflects how serious the condition is, while priority reflects how urgently the organization should respond. Those ideas often overlap, but they are not always identical. A severe issue in a less critical system may matter differently from a moderate issue in a system that supports essential business operations or handles highly sensitive data. Good evaluation considers likelihood, potential impact, regulatory exposure, data sensitivity, control dependencies, and the possibility that the issue is part of a larger pattern. A beginner should understand that not every finding deserves the same treatment, but that does not mean low-rated issues should be ignored forever. Small issues can combine into larger problems, especially when they reveal weak governance, repeated process failure, or a lack of ownership. Prioritization is about directing effort where it matters most while still maintaining enough discipline to keep the smaller problems from quietly becoming tomorrow's crisis. Root cause matters because organizations often waste energy fixing symptoms instead of fixing the conditions that created them. If an audit finds that user access reviews were not completed on time, the easy response is to demand that the missed review be finished immediately. That may close the immediate gap, but it may not address why the review was missed in the first place. The underlying cause could be poor staffing, unclear ownership, weak process design, missing automation, inadequate training, or unrealistic deadlines. If the real cause is not understood, the issue is likely to happen again. Root cause analysis, RCA, helps organizations look past the surface of the problem and ask why it occurred, what control failed, and what organizational factors allowed it to continue. Beginners sometimes think this sounds overly formal, but the idea is simple. If you only fix what is visible, you may reduce pain today, but you may also guarantee the same type of failure returns later in a slightly different form. Ownership is one of the most important parts of issue management because problems do not get resolved well when responsibility is vague. A finding may be discovered by internal audit, information security, compliance, or a risk team, but those groups are not always the ones who should remediate it. In most cases, the issue should be assigned to the person or function that owns the process, system, or control that needs to change. That owner must understand the problem, agree on the remediation path, and accept accountability for moving it forward. At the same time, governance functions need visibility so that open issues do not disappear into local teams with no follow-up. This creates a balance between operational ownership and centralized oversight. For a beginner, the lesson is that discovery and accountability are not the same thing. The team that notices the weakness helps shine a light on it, but the team that owns the environment usually has to carry out the corrective action, prove it was completed, and live with the consequences if it is delayed. Remediation planning turns recognition into action. A meaningful remediation plan explains what will be changed, who will do the work, how long it should take, what resources are needed, and how success will be confirmed. Weak remediation plans often sound reassuring, but say very little, using broad statements about improving controls without naming the actual changes that will occur. Stronger plans are realistic and tied to the actual condition that created the issue. They also consider temporary safeguards when the permanent fix will take time. For example, if a system cannot be upgraded immediately, the organization may tighten monitoring, limit access, or isolate part of the environment while longer-term work proceeds. Beginners should also understand that deadlines matter, but unrealistic deadlines can be as harmful as no deadlines at all. When target dates are set without understanding technical, staffing, or business constraints, teams miss them repeatedly, credibility drops, and the organization becomes numb to overdue issues. Good planning is honest, specific, and connected to the real operating environment. Monitoring open issues is where management discipline becomes visible. Once issues are entered into a tracking process, they need regular review so leaders can see what remains unresolved, what is overdue, what is trending in the wrong direction, and where additional escalation may be needed. An issue that sits open for months without movement is not just an administrative problem. It may signal that the organization lacks commitment, resources, authority, or clarity. Effective oversight reviews aging, repeated due date extensions, disputed ownership, and evidence that the proposed remediation may not fully address the root cause. This is also where escalation becomes important. If a business unit keeps delaying a high-risk issue because of cost or inconvenience, the matter may need to move upward to leaders who can weigh the risk against the business rationale. A beginner should see monitoring not as paperwork, but as a form of pressure that keeps the organization honest. If no one watches open issues carefully, weak controls can remain weak for a very long time. Exception management deserves special attention because it often creates confusion. An exception is not simply a forgotten requirement or a hidden violation. In a mature environment, an exception is a formal acknowledgement that a standard, policy, or control requirement is not being fully met, along with a documented explanation, risk evaluation, ownership assignment, approval, time limit, and any conditions that must be followed while the exception remains active. This matters because businesses sometimes need to operate in imperfect conditions. A legacy application may not support a required security feature yet, or a new business initiative may need limited temporary flexibility while a control catches up. The dangerous misconception is to treat exceptions as easy escape paths around controls. When that happens, the exception process becomes a loophole factory. Properly managed exceptions are supposed to be deliberate, visible, justified, and temporary whenever possible. They are a governance tool, not a way to avoid accountability or hide known risk behind formal language. A healthy exception process asks hard questions before approval. What requirement is being missed and why? What risk does the gap create? What compensating controls exist to reduce exposure? How long will the exception remain open? Who is accountable for correcting the condition if correction is expected? Who has the authority to accept the risk temporarily? These questions help prevent casual approvals that normalize weak control behavior. They also make sure the organization understands the difference between a business inconvenience and a true business necessity. For beginners, it helps to think of an exception as a visible trade-off. The organization is saying it understands the rule, understands the gap, understands the risk, and still believes a limited departure is justified under defined conditions. That can be reasonable in many cases, but only if the process is controlled. If exceptions are easy to obtain, hard to expire, and rarely reevaluated, the organization may slowly build a shadow version of its control environment where many rules exist on paper but not in practice. One of the most important ideas in this topic is that closure should mean more than updating a status field. An issue is not truly closed just because someone says the work is done. Closure should usually require evidence that the remediation was completed and that it actually reduced or removed the risk as intended. This may involve review by the risk function, testing by a control team, confirmation by audit, or validation by a system or process owner who can show the new state is operating as designed. Premature closure is dangerous because it creates false confidence. The records may look clean while the underlying condition remains unchanged or only partially corrected. Exception closure also matters because expired exceptions should not remain open indefinitely through inattention. Once an exception reaches its end date, the organization should either confirm the gap has been resolved, renew the exception through formal review, or escalate the unresolved condition appropriately. Good closure discipline protects the integrity of the whole program. A simple example can help connect these ideas. Imagine an internal review finds that a shared administrative account is still being used in a sensitive business application. The finding states that individual accountability is missing and that this practice conflicts with policy and increases the chance of misuse going undetected. The issue created from that finding would likely be assigned to the application owner or business technology team, with a remediation plan to replace the shared account with named accounts, update procedures, and verify monitoring. If the application cannot support the change immediately because of a legacy design limitation, the organization might consider an exception, but only after evaluating the risk, requiring stronger logging or oversight as a compensating control, setting a time limit, and obtaining approval from the right authority. If 6 months pass and nothing changes, the problem is no longer just a technical weakness. It becomes a governance failure because the organization knew the risk, documented it, and still allowed it to continue without an effective decision. As we close, the key idea is that issue, finding, and exception management gives an organization a disciplined way to deal with problems it already knows about. Findings help make weaknesses visible, issues help turn those observations into managed action, and exceptions create a formal method for limited and visible departures from requirements when business reality demands flexibility. None of these processes are meant to create bureaucracy for its own sake. They exist because known weaknesses are among the most dangerous weaknesses, especially when they are poorly described, badly tracked, repeatedly extended, or quietly accepted without the right approval. C-Risk expects you to think about how organizations move from observation to decision, from decision to action, and from action to validation. When that path is clear, accountable, and regularly reviewed, the organization becomes more trustworthy, more resilient, and far less likely to be surprised by risks it had already discovered but failed to manage well.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.